There's no real way to put this mildly. This is the camera of my dreams. It's the Hasselblad 907X with the CFV 100C digital back. So why have I soiled many a bed sheet at night dreaming about this camera? Well, in a nutshell, it kind of just ticks all of the boxes for me personally. It's small, insanely powerful, and as somebody who has a serious undying love for anything with a retro-inspired aesthetic and shooting experience, this is like the Marilyn Monroe of digital cameras. Now, I've been lucky enough to have this camera for a little over a month now, and I've been doing my best to shoot with it as much as physically possible. And while shooting with this camera, I've been constantly asking myself, does this live up to all of my expectations? And most importantly, does it offer a superior experience over any other camera that I've ever owned or shot with? Because do bear in mind that if you wanted to buy this entire camera and the lens with it, it would likely set you back somewhere around $10,500. So for that kind of investment, you would kind of hope it does. Well, I'm pleased to say that the short answer is yes, and also kind of no. And the long answer is, well, the rest of this video, so buckle up. Okay, so let's start with the positives. What do I love most about this camera? Well, the first reason is also the same reason why I love these two cameras that live just behind me here. Come here. Oh, there we go. That wasn't annoying. Now, these two are probably my two favorite cameras of all time. This is my very old Leica M8 and my old, but not quite as old, Fujifilm X Pro 2. Now, despite all of these cameras having three very different price points, they all have one fundamental thing in common, which is why I love them so much. They're just incredibly fun to use.
Of course!
Now, in my opinion, this Leica M8 is about as close as you can get to a film camera-like experience without actually having to shoot with a film camera, which ultimately creates its own fun set of unique challenges that break you away from the status quo of digital photography. And this X Pro 2 provides a very similar experience to that with its analog controls and all that kind of stuff and optical viewfinder, whilst also benefiting from having things like film simulation modes, which allows me to capture film-like results straight out of the camera for those odd occasions where I really just can't be bothered to deal with the editing side of the work. Now, this Hasselblad also offers a break from convention in terms of its shooting style. Its box-like design and front-mounted shutter button makes this feel like an incredibly retro experience, but at the same time you benefit from a bunch of modern luxuries. The main one being this large flip-up touchscreen on the back here to compose your photos and navigate the settings. Now, honestly, I thought this screen would completely break the immersion for me, but because the interface is just so clean and clinical, it kind of reminds me of the analog dials on these other cameras. Each option has a precise function and purpose rather than some other cameras, which we won't mention, Sony, which just feel like they are littered with page upon page of convoluted setting options and menus that make you feel as if you need a computing degree just to be able to change the white balance. Somehow, by offering less, they've managed to strike a really good balance between the conveniences of modern technology without impeding on the actual shooting experience itself. But if that didn't tickle your vintage photography pickle, then you can actually go one step further with this camera. You see, one of the big benefits to owning a camera like this is that it's somewhat modular in its design, and that means it's made up of two different parts. Now, obviously not including the lens, which we'll remove for now. This middle section here, which is conveniently labeled, is the 907X, which is technically the camera body, though in reality it's essentially just a hollow piece of metal that allows you to connect the lens to the brains back here. And this part is the CFV 100C, and this is where the sensor and all the imaging process stuff goes on. But because you can actually take this part off, that means that in the future, should I want to upgrade this part to a newer digital back, I can do that without the need to replace any of these other parts. Or equally, I could always change this part for an older body. So what do I mean by that? Well, because this is designed by Hasselblad, this digital back has also been made so that it will fit onto a number of older medium format film bodies, including the iconic 500 series cameras. Not only does that mean that this can shoot with that super cool top-down style optical viewfinder, but you can also attach vintage Hasselblad lenses to the front of all of that in order to create the perfect blend, in my opinion, of modern digital imaging and vintage aesthetics and handling. Now, I I cannot tell you how much I want to try that out for myself, but unfortunately, as you would kind of expect, vintage Hasselblad film camera bodies are still pretty expensive to buy. And that means until I get around to setting up my OnlyFans account to help fund getting one of those things, I will just have to stick with this for the meantime. On that note, if there are any sugar mummies and daddies watching who want to help me fund that kind of thing, leave a comment below. Anyway, sticking to the topic of blending the old with the new, despite its retro looks, one feature that makes this camera, I think, feel like you're shooting with something from the future is the fact that it has built-in storage. Yes, inside this tiny camera, they've managed to cram in 1 whole terabyte of internal memory, which means no more pissing about with memory cards. Now, that might not sound like such a big deal, but I can honestly tell you, after a month of shooting with this thing, I can't tell you how refreshing it is just to not have to worry about stupid things, either not bringing enough memory cards, or that constant worry that I'm going to run out of storage space mid-shoot with a client, or getting that crippling fear that the card I'm about to format may contain some images that I might not have backed up, even though I know I definitely just backed them up less than an hour ago. But what happens if I didn't transfer them successfully, and then I have to explain to the client why they haven't got their images, and then the bank repossesses my house and takes all my cameras, and my wife leaves me for a younger, more talented and competent photographer. All those very normal and totally rational trains of thought. What, just me? Anyway, with this, I don't have to worry about any of that, and even with it churning out huge 100 megapixel RAWs, which we'll talk about in just a minute, you still have to capture a serious amount of photos before you're going to fill up that 1 terabyte of storage. But just as an overflow, it also accepts a single CF Express Type B memory card, so you could quite easily add another 1 or 2 terabytes of memory if you really felt like you needed that much storage space. But arguably, the biggest difference between this camera and the two I just mentioned earlier is what's on the inside, because this thing packs in a huge 100 megapixel medium format sensor that's able to churn out 16-bit raw images. Now, as I've said many times to my wife during our relationship, and also to you guys on this channel, size isn't everything, but honestly, the images that this camera captures really are something else. The clarity and tonality it captures are just absolutely top tier, and while shooting at the full 100 megapixel resolution is admittedly a little bit overkill for the majority of things that I like to shoot, having the ability to make dramatic crops without suffering any kind of quality loss is a luxury I don't think I'll ever get tired of exploiting. Now, many people online rave about Hasselblad's color science being arguably the best in the business, and I really can't argue with them there. Not only do the photos look great straight out of the camera, but the flexibility of the raw files afterwards in post-production in particular is just on another level. Now, although this camera does boast 15 stops of dynamic range, which is certainly very impressive, that's not to say that it's completely infallible, and it's still entirely possible to blow out the highlights beyond recovery. But provided that you know that and you prioritize for the brightest highlights, you can always pull back the shadow detail without any real drawbacks in terms of image quality. But me sat here talking about how much the image quality kicks ass probably isn't that much of a surprise to you given what we're dealing with here. So what are the things about this camera that might make you think twice about ever owning one? Well, whilst I wouldn't class this camera as a slow camera per se, it certainly requires a much slower shooting pace compared to other cameras that I've used. What do I mean by that? Well, this really isn't the type of camera where you can expect to rattle off large bursts of images at breakneck speeds. I mean, given the sheer size of the images we're dealing with and what it has to process, that probably shouldn't be surprising. But in practical terms, that means you actually need to adopt a much more considered approach to photography, and personally, I don't think that's actually a bad thing. Shooting with this camera has certainly made me realize that over the years I've been somewhat spoilt by the quickening pace of modern cameras. This Hasselblad harks back to what photography used to be like, not only in aesthetics, but also handling. When I'm using most modern cameras these days, I really don't need to think all that hard about what I'm doing half the time, because so long as you just point it in the right direction, the advanced AI-driven computing power on board basically means that I'm almost guaranteed to get a perfect shot every time. And do not get me wrong, that is great from an efficiency standpoint, but I feel like it does make the whole experience a little bit soulless. So I'm kind of okay with cameras forcing me to think a little bit more about what I'm doing. It's also the same reason why I like cameras like this so much. These are slow and clunky, but again, much more enjoyable to shoot with compared to a camera that just takes away all of the thinking for you. In a weird kind of way, it's more refreshing than frustrating. But at the same time, if you've just forked out 10 grand expecting this camera to give you Sony-like rapidness, I could totally understand that there might be some disappointment. On that note, there's no IBIS on this camera either, which again is something I can personally live without, but after coming from a Sony camera where you can practically shoot during an earthquake and still get a shake-free shot, keeping a watchful eye on your shutter speed is just another thing I had to retrain myself to do. But to be fair, if IBIS is a must-have feature for you, then this camera's sibling, the X2D, does come included with this feature, albeit at the sacrifice of the retro charm. Anyway, the final thing to consider with this camera is that it doesn't have a mechanical shutter in front of the sensor like most other cameras do these days. Instead, Hasselblad actually install leaf shutters inside each of the lenses. Now, this has a number of advantages, which I'm not going to go too deeply into, but include things like being able to synchronize off-camera flash with any shutter speed, which is all very cool. But this does become a slight issue when it comes to picking lenses, because third-party glass for this camera system will not include leaf shutters inside them, and therefore you have to rely on this camera's electronic shutter instead. Now, that's all fine and dandy, apart from the fact that this camera has a pretty slow readout speed given the size of the sensor and the size of the files we're dealing with, and that means that rolling shutter can be a bit of an issue.
Wibbly wobbly, the Hulk, wibble wobble.
And effectively, that rules out being able to shoot fast-moving subjects, and in some cases you could even be restricted to using a tripod in order to avoid that jello-like effect ruining your images. And by doing that, you're going to be making an already slow shooting pace even slower. So for me and the types of stuff that I like to shoot, that kind of means that I'm locked into using Hasselblad lenses, which are amazing in terms of image quality, but are also way more expensive. Now, in credit to Hasselblad, the last few lenses that they have released have been more affordable. And I say affordable in air quotes because most people won't consider a $1,000 or $2,000 lens anywhere near affordable, but relative to Hasselblad lenses, these are considered budget options, definitely. And my hope is that the company will continue on this trend of providing more budget-friendly alternatives, because I think it's much needed if Hasselblad seriously want to entice people over to their world. So, with all of that said, is this camera worth dropping 10 G's for? Honestly, that's only a question you can answer. As for me, if it came down to owning this camera or paying the next 6 months worth of rent, then I would be dragging my mattress into a cardboard box faster than you can say leaf shutter. At least that way, when I inevitably have to resort to selling myself on the street, I'll at least have a 100 megapixel sensor to immortalize every soul-crushing moment in stunning 16-bit detail. What a time to be alive. Is this a camera you need? No. Is it a camera that is fun, produces incredible results, and will just make you fall in love with photography all over again? Possibly.